Now, there were a couple problems with Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Territory, dealing mainly to do with interpretations regarding the Constitution. You have to remember that Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed that the Constitution should be taken literally, and only those powers that are expressly stated in the Constitution should be given to the national government. The rest should then fall to the state's purview. However, in terms of executive authority, there is nothing in the Constitution that gives the president the right to purchase territory from another nation. So Jefferson kind of has to rely on the implied powers or the elastic clause of the Constitution, even though he spent the majority of Washington and Adams' presidency completely criticizing the government for their expansion of power. So when he submits his proposal to the Senate, he knows that this act will better the United States, but he also knows that he is going back on his democratic principles. He does claim that this is just an extension of the executive's right to make power or to make treaties with another nation. Despite fierce Federalist backlash, accusals of flip-flopping, the Democratic-Republican majority in the Senate passes the bill and approves the Louisiana Purchase. So as you can see here, the Louisiana Territory nearly doubles the size of the United States. It extends the land past the Mississippi River, and Jefferson hopes that this ultimately will help the United States in moving closer towards that ideal agrarian society because it adds so much land. This is a contrast, by the way, this agrarian society is a contrast to Alexander Hamilton's ideal vision of an urban and industrialized America. This idea of urban versus rural, agrarian versus industrialization is going to play out in future talks when we discuss sectionalism. So also, again, I do want to highlight the fact that the Federalists really look bad before criticizing Thomas Jefferson for flip-flopping, because the majority of the Americans view this was the right thing to do, and it just makes the Federalists look really petty. So even before Jefferson officially, it was approved that the Louisiana Purchase would go through, Jefferson persuaded Congress to fund the exploration of the West, and that this would be led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark. And of course, after the purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, the importance of such an exploratory expedition increased. Lewis and Clark and their team left in 1804 from St. Louis, as you can see on this map. They crossed the Rockies, reached the Oregon coast, and at the Pacific coast, they turned back and headed home, and they were back by 1806. And while there was a scientific component to this trip, as you can see here, these are excerpts from Clark's journal, where he is recording local flora and fauna. The purpose was mainly to find the quickest way to the Pacific, as well as survey the land and resources in this area, including the Native American population, because this area was intended for future expansion. The Lewis and Clark expedition was very successful at the time, but oddly enough, it really wasn't discussed in American history until about the 21st century, at which time more credit was given not only to the intrepid explorers, but also to Sacagawea, who is pictured here on the right. She was a Shoshone guide who served as an interpreter and a cultural liaison between the expedition and the native tribes. And her presence really promoted the idea that this was a peaceful group. This painting, by the way, will come out of the about 20, 30 years later after the Lewis and Clark exploration. Okay, so we're going to talk about quite a bit of constitutional court cases here in U.S. history, but all of these cases owe their existence to the precedent set by Chief Justice John Marshall's ruling in Marbury v. Madison. Now, when we talk about Supreme Court cases, it's v, not versus, just something to remember. So this story unfolds like this. The Constitution gives the executive branch the right to appoint judges, right? You guys know that. And at the last minute of John Adams' presidency, he issues a bunch of appointments. And these appointments are typically referred to as midnight judges because they're judges that are appointed at the 11th hour, as we call it, of Adams' presidency. Now you can imagine the Democratic Republicans, when they took office, were not pleased at all by this, and they actually refused to deliver these appointments. William Marbury, who was one of these midnight judges and was offered a justice of the peace position, he sues James Madison, who's then Secretary of State, when he refuses to issue the appointment. So this is an act basically of legal tap dancing, if you will. We have pictured here Chief Justice John Marshall. We'll talk much more about him later and what he does to increase the power of the federal government. On one hand, he denies Marbury's appointment. He says that basically the Judiciary Act of 1789 gave more power than the Constitution actually allowed. So Marbury's appointment was technically unconstitutional. And that certainly pleased the Democratic Republicans. So they get a short-term win. But in the long term, because the Supreme Court ruled on this case, it established what we refer to as judicial review. And judicial review gives the Supreme Court the authority to determine if acts issued by Congress or the President are allowed under the Constitution. Now, you'll remember that several people, including Thomas Jefferson, when they created the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions as a response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, actually tried to claim that power for the states. So judicial review actually says it's the Supreme Court's power, which only increases, again, the power of the national government. So you can imagine that Thomas Jefferson and other Democratic Republicans were definitely not pleased by this ruling. By the way, Chief Justice John Marshall is Thomas Jefferson's cousin. And so you have to kind of wonder what, dinners, family reunions must have been like, because the two of them really kind of continued to head butts throughout or butt heads to butt heads throughout Thomas Jefferson's presidency. So as a result of this, Thomas Jefferson really wants to rid himself of this federal-laden Supreme Court and judicial branch. He suspends the Alien and Sedition Acts and releases those jailed as a result of its passing. And he also tries just for straight removal through impeachment of the justices and several of these judges. But despite the removal of one federal district court judge on grounds of mental instability, Congress really was unable to remove any Supreme Court justices. The House did impeach Samuel Chase, but ultimately the Senate acquitted him on the grounds of lack of evidence. And you'll remember that just because somebody is impeached does not mean that they are going to be kicked out of office. They need a 2/3 majority in order for that to happen. But the Supreme Court justices, this event is really not lost on them. Even though nobody was kicked out of office, it did cause several of the Federalist members of the judicial branch to just sit up a little bit straighter and kind of take note of these Democratic Republicans and try to avoid partisan politics in their rulings. So Thomas Jefferson wins his re-election in 1804 by a large majority, but that in no way means that his second term was filled with any less drama than his first term. And the first bit of drama that we're going to talk about is the fabulous story of Aaron Burr, who's pictured here. For reasons we're not going to fully go into, Jefferson never really trusted Burr. In 1804, when Thomas Jefferson ran for re-election, he, along with his fellow Democratic Republicans, decided to drop Aaron Burr from the ticket. So he was no longer going to be able to run as vice president, which is really kind of a kick in the ego. Burr then embarks on a series of misadventures. He decides to run for governor of New York in 1804. And at the time, the Federalists in the northern states of New England worried mightily about the growing power of the South and the Democratic Republicans. And they began formulating a plan to secede from the Union and viewed New York as a critical piece of this plan. And so they make a secret pact with Burr. They say, okay, Burr, if we help you win this election and sway some of these votes, then you need to agree that one of your first acts as governor is that you are going to vote for secession and you're going to join these northern states. And so Burr basically, he agrees to this, but unfortunately, he loses. And he blames Alexander Hamilton and this smear campaign that Hamilton was a part of for his loss. And after an exchange of a series of letters between Burr and Hamilton and third-party members, Burr ultimately challenges Hamilton to a duel because Burr feels like his honor has been irreparably impugned. Okay, and the only way for his honor to be restored is by challenging Hamilton to a duel. We're not 100% clear as to the exact events. Who fired first? Did Hamilton purposely throw away his shot in order to maintain his own principles? We do know this, that Burr shot Hamilton, and Hamilton died shortly after as a result. Despite our uncertainty now, though, people back then had absolutely no problem blaming Burr and completely villainized him for his role in this. So Burr moves west and ultimately devises a plan to take Mexico from Spain and unite it with the Louisiana Territory, and then he figured that he would rule over this territory and create a new nation. The problem is, though, this plot leaked to President Jefferson, who was, as you imagine, not too pleased and had Burr arrested for treason. And who should preside over this treason court? None other than Jefferson's favorite cousin, Chief Justice John Marshall. Marshall ultimately acquits Burr, claiming that the Constitution definition of treason can only be committed in a time of war, and the lack of evidence to an overt act made Burr innocent. So while he's acquitted of this crime, Burr's political career is completely ruined. He spends some time overseas, moves back to the US, marries a rich widow to pull himself out of his impoverished life, spends all of her money. She sues for divorce and is, surprisingly enough, because courts never or hardly rule in the favor of women during this time period, is granted this divorce. But it happens, this divorce is granted the same year that Burr dies in 1836. And that, my friends, is the sad, sad tale of Aaron Burr. Next, we're going to talk about foreign policy really quickly before moving on to John Madison.